The Doctor, Romana, and Nathan Ivan, P.I., stood on absolute nothingness, staring into the giant opening canine maw of Anubis. They attempted to back away, although they could feel something beneath their feet, even if they could see no evidence of it, and their steps felt real enough. The distance between themselves and the gaping array of enormous fangs remained unchanged. Anubis, still seated upon his obsidian throne, but now over 100 times the size of any ordinary Albion or Gallifreyan, could easily have swallowed them all with one snap of his huge muzzle. Instead of this expected crunching termination of their sojourn in this strange black void, an odd braying sound began to emanate from the opening before them. Given the extent to which their own voices had been muffled upon entering this realm, the sound under normal circumstances would have been deafening. As it was tolerable, if persistent and grating. In a disarming leap from the perilous to the ridiculous, the entity before them sounded as if it was saying, "Ah!" Romana leaned towards the Doctor.
Do you think he needs dental work?
She asked with half a smile. The Doctor shook his head, frowning, but could not quite suppress a chuckle. "I'm not that sort of doctor," he pointed out, "but his teeth look unnervingly healthy to me." The sound continued, but changed tone slightly. Now it sounded more like it was saying a long and unending "Perhaps he's from Yorkshire?" the Doctor suggested to Romana. At last the sound stopped. The expression on the dog face of Anubis seemed to have morphed into a frown, not so much of anger, more of supreme effort. The sound began again, this time sounding more like "Now I'm confused," the Doctor confessed. "Is he from Yorkshire or Germany?" Romana could not help but giggle. The portion of the sound continued for some time before terminating in a humming noise. The head of the figure now began to move its nose to the left with aching slowness. Once finished, it then switched direction, but increased in speed a tad. The two Time Lords and Nathan realized it was shaking its head. The motion completed, then repeated several more times at what would have been a normal speed for a canine on Earth or Albia.
"Anubis!"
The figure barked at them, sounding both normal and pleased with itself. Before any of them could follow up on this proud declaration, it then added,
"And I am not Anubis."
It was hard to tell, but the Cairoan god appeared to be smiling enigmatically. The Doctor bowed his head towards the nose of the creature. "Well, we're very pleased to meet you, whoever you are. Are you a creature of the bulk?" The Doctor's tone betrayed his own lack of confidence in this being so. The entity's giant smile broadened.
"I can see there will be many questions, but I suppose my introduction did me no favors. So let me try to answer your first question as fully as possible, and in doing so, hopefully head off a few more in the process."
The Doctor inclined his head in gratitude, inviting the giant being to continue.
"I am not truly Anubis, since, as you suspected, such a being in all its multidimensional greatness would be incomprehensible to you, and you, in your limited simplicity, just as meaningless to it."
The Doctor and Romana looked a trifle offended by this description of their status. Nathan was merely wide-eyed with wonder and curiosity. "So you are some sort of construct, an avatar, so to speak, to act as translator between our two realms?" the Doctor asked. Anubis nodded.
"Precisely. The four-dimensional pocket we now inhabit is neither of your similarly dimensioned universe nor my true self's 10-dimensional realm. It is a halfway house where we can communicate more freely."
Romana put up a hand, frowning.
I'm sorry. 10-dimensional?
Anubis shook his head patiently.
"Yes, 10. I'll get back to that shortly. For now, just let me say that my time-like dimension does not align with your universe's equivalent axis. Hence my difficulty in speaking at first. I had to tune our timelines to be parallel and in sync. This might also account for any discomfort you are experiencing at the moment."
The doctor shook his head, waggling a finger in his ear.
Yes, it is moderately uncomfortable, but nothing we cannot cope with,
he assured the god.
But 10-dimensional?
Romana persisted.
We assumed you were one of the primary entities of the book. In other words, an 11-dimensional creature?
As best his canine visage could convey any emotion, Anubis now projected an expression of wistful regret.
The Tomb of Anubis, how apt a name.
The multi-dimensional entity sighed.
Yes, once we too believed we were the pinnacle of existence, supreme rulers of all that was and all that could be. We learnt of our mistake the hard way.
The doctor nodded gravely, but looked a trifle distracted.
We would love to hear more about your species and your woes, if you think we have the time.
The four-dimensional proxy for the real Anubis gave a most human of responses. He chuckled at the doctor.
You are worrying about the imminent release of Icthulhu, no doubt. Fear not, no time is passing here as measured in your little universe. In fact, I'll even release you all an hour. Yes, that's one of your measures, isn't it? An hour before I took you. Just be careful not to run into yourselves.
The doctor and Romana bowed their heads in gratitude, while the smiling Nathan tipped his hat to the creature.
As much as my species has any concept of language or nomenclature, I think we would come closest to a name by your standards in that of the sus kind. As I mentioned, we lorded it over all your lower dimensional realms, 1 through 9, the countless lesser dimensioned universes. Each lower order framework supporting, of course, innumerable variations upon each theme. We practically played marbles with an endless supply. And then there were the others. At the same instant we became aware of these entities, which looked down upon us much in the way we look down upon you, they became aware of us. Again, while they have many names, in my reality, as much as can be represented to you, we know them collectively as the Wittern. Yes, no true vowels if you're taking notes.
The doctor looked up from his notebook, which he had retrieved from his satchel along with a pen. He had indeed been taking notes, and looked like a naughty schoolboy caught cheating in exams.
The Wittern is perhaps a poor choice of name, all things considered, since it is hard to say if they truly became aware of us at all. In many ways, they often appear to us as witless as you lower dimensional creatures. Nevertheless, as soon as we became aware of them, they began consuming us. Soon it seemed wherever we would wander, we would run into some projection or extension of themselves. And once encountered, our energy would be absorbed by them, and we would cease to be. Where once we had strode the multiverses like colossi, suddenly we were sent to our rooms without supper. Or rather, to avoid becoming supper, we hid in our rooms. This pocket realm or rather, my true self, has created is safe enough. The room in the Anubis tomb is about as far as I can extend myself. Any more than that, and it is likely I'd be eaten. So you see, it really might as well be my tomb.
Romana frowned curiously.
So you have no further contact with our universe, no influence at all?
Anubis looked at her strangely, a little pointedly in fact.
We can detect vibrations through the bulk. We hear prayers to us, just cannot respond. We get particularly clear images when our name is spoken. Quite recently, someone was rather disparaging about the monument built in our honor over the aforementioned tomb. Was quite rude about its form, in fact.
Romana's eyes darted about a little desperately. She looked uncharacteristically uncomfortable and flustered. The doctor put down his pen and closed the notebook around it.
Ah, so that is why you want to help us. Your enmity with the 11-dimensional entities, I mean.
Anubis cocked his head at him.
I have no desire to help you.
Anubis retorted, puzzled.
Then what are your plans for us?
Romana asked with some concern. Anubis frowned.
My plan is to set you back on a collision course with Ichtultu and his minions. We have no interest in your fates. We do, however, love to see Ichtultu frustrated, much like he has frustrated myself and the rest of the Sus kind. And who knows, perhaps if you force them to go on a diet, you might weaken them a little. The Witten are only one dimension higher than ourselves. Perhaps the problems they create are not insurmountable. Maybe they can even be dealt with. Or perhaps their higher dimensional wisdom is simply too subtle to comprehend. In any event, by setting you cats loose among the proverbial pigeons, we certainly have nothing to lose, and perhaps everything to gain.
The Doctor and Romana exchanged sceptical glances. Even Nathan had lost some of his good cheer. Is there nothing more you can do to aid us? The Doctor implored. We were blocked by an extrusion of the Cthulhu in the middle corridor. Should we try the Osiris one instead? A look of surprised delight passed over Anubis's face.
Oh, Osiris! Another of my Sus-kind brethren! I didn't realize we shared a prison or tomb. But no, I shouldn't bother him, not unless you want a repeat performance.
Anubis advised, smiling.
But what about the Setash statue?
Romana insisted. The giant avatar of Anubis shrugged his shoulders.
Well, you know, us gods, be they 10 or 11 dimensional, are quite vast. We sometimes forget what's at our own feet. Farewell, time travelers.
With this last remark, Anubis became still and began to shrink. As he did so, the base of the throne rose up to reach the level of the companion's feet. At that moment, although the statue remained utterly still, they caught the sound of Anubis's voice for one final time, distant and echoing.
If you survive, perhaps you could visit our 10-dimensional realm. You never know, we might even build a flattering monument of one of you there, in your honor.
The final signs of normality restored were the torches of Romana and Nathan picking out patches of the pictogram-covered walls fading back into existence. The Doctor put away his notebook and recovered his own torch. Well, I'm not entirely sure how helpful that was, he declared, unimpressed. Romana could not find it in her heart to disagree. Given no other options, and, following Anubis's advice for whatever it was worth, the trio returned to the Setash tunnel. They immediately felt the return of its oppressive atmosphere. The tentacled tree statue avoided and obscured much of their light with its greenish-brown trunk and branches, but they could still see it was much as they had left it, blocking the entire corridor. Almost the entire corridor. As the Doctor shone his torch at the foot of the statue, they noticed the lowest branches did not quite touch the floor. The Doctor pondered dubiously. I suppose that was what Anubis meant. Hardly the best advice ever. We may be able to get under those lowest boughs if we army crawl. It's still just as risky as it was before, though. If we touch that thing, we shall almost certainly lose our minds. Nathan and Romana looked as grim as the Doctor.
Well, I did see service in the last Great War,
Nathan conceded reluctantly.
And you know I'm at least as good as you at this sort of thing. Remember Aquathi?
Romana added. The Doctor nodded, then unslung the rope he was carrying from his shoulder. I suggest we all tether ourselves together from belt to belt. That way, if any one of us gets into trouble, one or both of the others should be able to pull them free. However, I would recommend against testing this for the safekeeping of marbles. Romana unslung her rope, and seeing this, Nathan left his coiled on his shoulder. 2 ropes would suffice.
Who goes first?
The detective asked, curious as to who should attach to whom. Obviously, it should be me, the Doctor declared firmly. Romana shook her head and waggled a finger at him.
Now, Doctor, I'm not saying you're fat.
She began.
Far from it. But you are a little thicker than me. As the lowest profile Time Lord here, I think it's wisest if I take the lead.
The doctor frowned at her, desperately searching his brain for a viable objection.
Time Lord?
Nathan asked, seemingly determined to get an answer.
Marina Delamere called you both that. What did she mean? What are you?
The doctor shook his head wearily. We are Time Lords, Gallifreyans, not Zerons, he explained tersely.
Gallifrey?
Nathan responded, puzzled.
Never heard of it.
Good, the doctor replied, before turning to Romana. And no, I can't think of a good reason why you shouldn't go first, but rest assured I'll be right behind you. Romana smirked at him.
And I'll be on the other side to pull you free if your butt's too big.
The doctor rolled his eyes at her, then began to tie his rope to Nathan's belt, while Romana tied hers to the doctor.
The left-hand branch looks a little higher than the one on the right,
Nathan observed. They all agreed this looked the most promising route. Before allowing Romana to be the first to take the risk, they all threw, or rather slid, their bags and other loose items, such as trench coats, under the left side low-hanging branch. They all hoped they would slide through just as easily. Romana began her face-down squirming progress along the passageway. The doctor's hearts were in his mouth as her butt barely missed the lowest dip of that hellish tendril. Then she had moved on, to no ill effects. The doctor wondered if he should clench his buttocks or relax them to present his lowest profile. He then wondered if relaxing them might lead to a different unfortunate accident. He shrugged and reasoned he would have to cross that particular bridge if and when it arrived. With resignation, he lay flat on the floor and began his crawl. Out of the corner of his eye, the doctor could see the sickening vision of the trunk shift downwards in his field of view and out of sight. He knew now that at any moment his posterior was about to pass under the dangling branch. Suddenly, he felt himself wrenched forward with considerable force, sliding over 2 feet across the floor, out of control. He carefully turned his head to take stock of the situation. He was almost clear of the demonic obstacle. His leg was a little too close to the trunk for his liking, but if he moved carefully he should be fine. He then twisted his neck to look ahead. In the sparse light provided by the lanterns Romana had left on the floor, he could see the Time Lord herself some way up the corridor, sitting on her backside, with her legs splayed out, the rope between them clutched in her hands. The doctor carefully squirmed the next couple of feet, then stood up and offered her his hand. "What on Gallifrey was all that?" he demanded as she took his outstretched arm and allowed him to help her to her feet.
I'm sorry, Doctor,
She began, dusting herself down.
but you couldn't see what I could see from where I was standing.
The doctor continued to frown, but waved for her to elaborate.
As you moved, your bum jiggled up and down slightly with every shift of your legs from one to the other. The only time you would have fit underneath was when a leg was fully extended, either one. So when you were as close as you were going to get with a leg out, I pulled you through as far and as fast as I could. And you're welcome.
The doctor smiled and shook his head at her. Thank you, Romana. You did well. Now for our plucky detective. Together they both turned back to the Ichthultu Setesh statue. Oh no, the doctor said faintly. Nathan Aeonne had clearly started his own traversal of the obstruction without waiting. His own ample rear must have brushed the branch. Now he lay quivering and twisting beneath it in the throes of a fit. The doctor and Romana both grabbed the rope leading from the doctor's belt to the unfortunate Albion. Together they hauled him quickly through, taking care to avoid any further contact with this bulk extrusion. Lying on the floor before them, they rolled him over onto his back. He was still fully in the grip of a seizure, his eyes rolled up into his skull, foam seeping from between his lips.
Doctor, what should we do?
Romana asked. The doctor shook his head, uncertain of the best course. I have had some experience of people being revived from the immediate after effects of bulk exposure. There is one technique I can employ. The question is, will we be any better off with what emerges? From what I saw on Mondas, and what we both experienced in the asylum on Abydos, he may be gone from us forever. He has, after all, through his encounter with Miss Delamere, already experienced a dangerous level of sanity-stripping revelations. Romana nodded her understanding.
I know it may already be too late, but we have to try.
The doctor inclined his head in agreement. Then he turned to face the prone detective. He slapped him hard across the face. Romana looked aghast. She had not been expecting such a primitive form of intervention, perhaps something a little more Venusian. Nathan's head spun sideways from the force of the blow, his right cheek resting against the paving stones, eyes screwed tightly shut. Slowly, his head rotated to face the Time Lords, eyes still closed.
What did I do?
The detective grumbled. The Doctor and Romana looked amazed.
Nathan, it's the Doctor. Do you recognize me?
Nathan's eyes crept open.
Of course I recognize you. Identification's my business. Now, who's giving me a pasting, and why?
The Doctor and Romana looked at each other, still disbelieving of their good fortune.
It's astounding,
Romana gushed.
Given all his poor mind has already suffered, I thought this would be the final straw.
The Doctor nodded vigorously. Indeed, in spite of our expectations as to the weakness of his mental constitution, it seems his experience have actually strengthened it. It's almost as if he learned resilience. Nathan pulled a face at both of them.
I'm right here, you know,
he said snarkily.
I can hear you guys.
Romana and the Doctor helped Nathan to his feet. Once certain he was truly sound of mind and body, they set about collecting their scattered gear before moving on. They had only walked another 10 yards beyond the disturbing statue when they encountered yet another opening leading down. Here there were more steps, heading east as with the corridor they had just traversed. Its construction still fit with everything they had so far encountered in the tomb complex, distinctly Chiroan in style, right down to the inscriptions and images covering every wall. However, much like the last flight of stairs they had descended, there was a preponderance of hints and touches of things beyond the realm of the Upsilon Orionis system or even this universe. Increasing numbers of snaking objects, other images which might have looked at home on Earth, but only in the studio of Escher, a very disturbed Escher. The stairs now turned left through 90 degrees. They were as steep as before, but something shifted in their execution as the trio descended. In some ways, it was almost as if they were becoming more perfect, as if some higher intelligence beyond your typical Albion or Chiroan had guided the hands which made them. Another right-angled turn, taking them west and even deeper into this uncanny chasm. The un-Albion nature of the masonry was only heightened as they descended, most notably in each step beginning to grow taller, so that eventually they became uncomfortable for the Time Lords and Nathan to use. Another turn to the south, and ever deeper into the pit, until a final turn had them moving eastwards once more. By now they were having to help one another down every step, and the staircase ceiling seemed unnecessarily high. At last the stairs levelled out into a platform. In stark contrast to the eerily careful construction they had just witnessed, the entrance ahead looked like a natural cave. There seemed to be a source of illumination within, but their eyes could make out no details due to that glow. Together, the Doctor, Romana and Nathan stepped forward and through the jagged door. Any complaints they may have had about the height of the ceiling in the lower staircase seemed utterly petty when confronted with what lay before them. They had entered a vast natural cavern, one which could easily contain 3 or 4 good-sized cathedrals. The roof was hung with vast stalactites, the largest of which would have dwarfed most trees. The cave floor was similarly strewn with stalagmites, reaching upwards like bizarre stone anthills. It was from these stone structures, both above and below, that the cavern's strange illumination came. Some glowed with a faintly orange hue, while others had a more greenish phosphorus tint. There seemed no pattern to the distribution of these colours, just a random mix. It was oddly reminiscent of old CRT computer monitors. The source of energy for this lighting was unclear. Was it natural luminescence born of strange compounds within the rock? Were there deposits of ores formed from caverite or plumber, or both combined? Could it be radioactivity, or a combination of all these factors? Or was it a less pleasant possibility? Did these seemingly natural stone lamps gain their power from a less than natural source? Were they being fed energy from the bulk? For now these questions remained unanswered, as there were more pressing concerns. Between the stalagmites the floor was sandy and largely flat. They could see a set of footsteps leading from where they stood in the direction of the eastern end of the cavern. Somebody had been there before them. At that far end of the cave was the first unnatural object to grab their attention. Carved in the same fashion as the final steps they had descended, immaculate yet inappropriately scaled, was a 60-foot-high plinth. More unhelpful stairs were worked into this monstrous construction, leading to a large flat square upon its top. On this elevated piazza was a jarringly crudely rendered monolith, itself some 30 feet high. At its base, barely visible at this distance, was the tiny figure of a man facing it, his arms raised. With a wordless nod of agreement, the two Time Lords and Nathan began to run across the cavern floor, weaving between the stalagmites, making the most direct route possible for the stairs in the plinth. Rocky pillars aside, they encountered no further obstacles until they reached the stairs themselves. These were obstruction enough, being around waist high. Clearly they had not been built with Albions or Gallifreyans in mind. Using hands and ropes, they made their best possible speed up the side of the almost polished perfection of the plinth. With much struggle and effort, they finally made it to the penultimate perch on this oversized flight of steps. Together they mimed to each other to climb the last steps silently and to keep their heads down so as to remain unseen. With this agreed, they all wiggled onto the final stair and peeked over the edge into the square beyond. Apart from being much closer, things had altered somewhat since they began their climb, and not for the better. The figure standing before the monolith, white-haired and in black tails, was obviously Dr. Nugati. He had his arms raised over his head and was chanting in some strange mixture of ancient Kairoan and other less savoury, unspeakable tongues. This, however, was as they had expected. What was happening to the vast eastern wall of the cavern behind the monolith was the terrifying change. Stretching from the cavern floor to ceiling was a gash in the universe itself. They had seen its like before, the clams of death, like that which they had encountered in space between Hungaria and Cairo while on board the A-36 airship. That was where all three of them had seen one before, and recently. Of course, the Doctor and Romana had once seen one through a portal in an attic in Ealing. None of these prior experiences had prepared them for seeing one in the room with them. It was so close, it seemed to be touching the far side of the plinth. Currently it was still quite narrow, no wider than that same stone construction at its widest point. Nevertheless, it was undeniably growing. Looking at it at such a close distance, it looked like an impossible jumble of images, and more, almost as if every colour, every sound, every sensation were clamouring to exist at once, simultaneously, within its nightmarish maelstrom. The Doctor leapt onto the upper platform, closely followed by Romana and Nathan.
Dr. Nugati,
He yelled.
stop this madness.
Romana leaned towards him.
Doctor, does that ever work?
She hissed behind her hand, sounding doubtful. The functionally immortal Albion did stop, at least his chanting. He lowered his arms and slowly turned to face them, smiling.
Why, hello, Doctor, isn't it?
Nugati said with mocking friendliness.
And two of your companions from the A-36, I see. How good of you all to join me. I'm afraid it's a little too late to stop. My part of the bargain's all done.
His final statement was made with a grin and a wink. The Doctor and his companions took a few steps towards the insane Hungarian medic, but were halted by him holding up a warning hand. The Doctor decided not to press things physically just yet, and elected to use his mind and words instead.
Dr. Nugati, you must see you cannot control this. Nothing good will come of it. You will be destroyed along with the rest of the universe. Look!
The Doctor's last word was issued with a firm finger jabbed towards the opening rift. Dr. Nugati looked casually over his shoulder at the heaving sea of chaos within. Among the jumble of sensations, hints of vast subway train-sized tentacles could be glimpsed oozing past the unnatural opening.
Oh, I'll be all right, Doc,
Nugati said cavalierly.
I have friends in high places. Even if this universe goes, I've been assured of the existence of many, many more. And I shall have all the time in the world to enjoy them, even if you do not. Besides, this cannot be reversed.
The Doctor fixed him with a steely gaze.
We have been informed otherwise,
he said sternly. Now Nugati's smile dropped and his expression also hardened.
Well, we can't have that, can we?
He said coolly.
Minion?
He then called out with a snap of his fingers. At that sign, a shadowy, smoky apparition stepped from behind the monolith. It looked roughly like an 8-foot-high bird of prey, but formed of thick, oily smoke and fumes. The Doctor and his companions knew from past experience that it was solid enough when it came to the fight. The air was split by a frantic clanging noise. Nathan had drawn the Nepalian phoenix bell. The black-winged thing had been slowly spreading those mysterious cloudy wings, preparing to attack. Now it froze, almost as if it recognized the significance of that clamorous tolling.
You puffed up glorified housebreaker.
Nugati spat contemptuously at the detective.
That's mine. You have no idea what you're doing.
Nathan cocked his head at the infuriated medic.
Oh, I think I have some idea,
he said with a cheeky nod up towards the roof of the cave with his forehead. Now everyone heard the noise which Nathan must have already caught, a great whooshing, roaring sound. There must have been some sort of flue hidden amongst the stalactites, leading all the way up to the surface. Doubtless there was some exit equally hidden, set discreetly high in the Anubis monument itself, an ear, a nostril, who could say? The one who undoubtedly could was the flaming entity of the Phoenix, who burst from the ceiling to land next to his friend, Nathan Aeonne. Having learnt its lesson from Dunbar House, it took care not to stand too close to the detective. Dr. Nugati clicked his fingers once again.
Creature,
he ordered imperiously.
Kill him.
The black-winged thing finished extending its wings. As it did so, Nathan cried to the Phoenix,
Go get him, boy!
The Phoenix and the smoky black entity both took flight at the same instant in time. They crossed paths with barely a yard between them, but did not touch or collide. Each had a different goal in mind. Nathan tried to jump aside as the black monster aimed itself straight at his chest. He was not entirely successful. While its head and talons missed, its wing caught him full in the ribs. The unfortunate detective was sent sailing backwards almost over the edge of the plinth. There he lay on the flagstones, unmoving. The black creature flew on and turned sharply to hang in the air, staring back at its prey. While this had been going on, a different story had unfolded at the other end of the piazza. The Phoenix had ignored its smoky counterpart and flew instead straight for Nugati. Dr. Nugati's Albion eyes widened to almost impossible proportions, and he threw up his arms in front of his face in an effort to defend himself. The Doctor and Romana, who had already been facing Nugati, got the perfect view of what happened next. It almost looked as if the Phoenix were embracing its old master, or perhaps captor, as it wrapped its flaming rings around him. The Hungarian agent of the bulk was utterly hidden from view, but his blood-curdling screams ensured his presence was felt by all. After a few seconds, the fiery bird released its prey and launched itself straight up to hover over him. Dr. Nugati was still moving, though it did not seem like this would continue for much longer. Every square inch of his clothing was aflame. The screaming was incessant and unbearable to hear in spite of all the evil he had caused. He flailed his burning arms around him in a desperate but futile attempt to beat out the flames. Then he fell silent and collapsed to the floor, the fire left to its own devices. The black-winged thing, who had hovered just above and behind the fallen Nathan, suddenly became more expressive than anyone had thought capable. It gave every impression of glancing at its smouldering master, then across at the triumphant Phoenix, and giving an avian shrug. Clearly it decided there was no more to be gained here, flew straight up to the roof where the Phoenix had entered, and disappeared. The Phoenix, seeing this, launched itself in hot pursuit, and within moments had also vanished. And so the Doctor and Romana were left alone, save for a fallen detective and a smouldering bulk worshipper and an ever-widening rift in the fabric of space and time. They turned and took a step towards Nathan, then stopped when they heard a snore. "I think he'll be all right," the Doctor reassured Romana. They then turned back to the monolith, where the gently smoking form of Dr. Nugati could be seen nearby. As they drew closer, they noticed he was still twitching a little.
Do you suppose he's still alive?
Romana asked.
I mean, he did take all those weird ichors and argon blood to gain immortality, more or less. Do you think he succeeded?
The Doctor gave a grim, twisted smile. "Oh, there's no doubt he succeeded," he pronounced confidently. "But as to whether he's still alive, who's to say? Though if he is, I'll bet he wishes he wasn't." They turned their attention away from the blackened, convulsing thing, and fixed it instead on the monolith he'd been praying to. Freed from other distractions, they finally noticed a small recess on its surface, shaped like a winged scarab beetle. Upon closer inspection, they could see this hole was filled by the green jade shape of the amulet itself. The Doctor and Romana both frowned thoughtfully.
Dr. Nugati did seem to go through an awful lot of chanting to get this rift thing going,
Romana noted.
Do you think there's still more of a recital required to undo it?
The doctor waggled his head noncommittally. All the while the rift widened. At that moment the tip of a tentacle poked through. The two Time Lords held their breaths, expecting the worst. Then it withdrew, and they each let out a sigh.
I haven't the faintest idea what he said, do you? And what if we have to say it all backwards? If the universe doesn't end before we're through, I imagine I might just die of boredom,
was the doctor's assessment.
Reverse the chant, reverse the process.
Romana mused to herself.
Yes,
The doctor agreed.
Anubis did seem to make much of that whole reverse thing.
Romana nodded. The room began to hum and shake, the effects of the rift becoming more pronounced.
Oh,
Romana cried in sudden realization.
Anubis did help us after all. If he hadn't sent us back an hour earlier, we'd have never made it in time.
Arguably, he still might not have sent us far enough back,
The doctor noted grimly.
On the other hand, at least we haven't interfered with our past selves and completely reversed his good work.
Both Time Lords suddenly froze and stared each other in the eyes excitedly.
Reverse!
They both exclaimed together. They also reached towards the scarab amulet simultaneously, each ending up with a hand on either wing. With a courteous nod to one another, they withdrew the scarab amulet, performed an impressive feat of synchronized one-handed juggling, and swapped the wing they were holding for the other. They then replaced the amulet back in the recess. Only now it was the black face of the winged scarab which was visible. The room was still juddering and rumbling. It was impossible to see any change in the progress of the rift. One of the mighty stalactites broke free of the ceiling and crashed to the floor of the cavern, shattering both itself and several innocent stalagmites in the process.
It's closing!
Romana shouted excitedly. The doctor looked back to the rift. It was not exactly racing to close, but it was just discernible that the edges were now moving closer together. The vibrations had also begun to lessen. The doctor and Romana watched in awed silence as the gateway to the 11-dimensional realm of the bulk eased closed with painful slowness. Eventually, the widest part of the rift, which still seemed to touch the edge of the plinth, was barely 3 feet wide.
Almost there,
said the doctor. 2.5 feet.
almost there.
He repeated. 2 feet. Something stepped through the rift and stood on the plinth before them. The rift snapped shut behind it and vanished, leaving only ordinary cavern wall. The thing standing before the two Time Lords was approximately the figure of a woman, but one where the artist had taken some license, or possibly something stronger. And whatever it was not good. The figure was blackened and disfigured, and yet simultaneously held much which was familiar. The dress and boots, which had both once been cream-coloured, had accrued a great deal of grime, mostly soot or oil by the look of it. The clothing now looked more black than white. This colour scheme appeared almost universal. Wherever flesh could be seen, it looked charred and the skin flaky. Her hair, while probably always black or very dark brown, had acquired a far more matted and distressed look than was probably desired. Her face looked almost skeletal, parts of the nose and lips missing to expose cartilage above and appalling dental work below. Yet, in spite of this blackened and ruined visage, it was still undeniably familiar. The doctor leaned towards Romana, pointing towards the figure with one hand, while raising his other to talk behind.
Okay, that one's the Rani,
he hissed to his friend. The Rani gave a piercing screech and flung both her hands, palms forwards, fingers raised, towards the other two Time Lords. The doctor and Romana felt a kick to their chests, like a mule, and were flung backwards some distance to lie on their backs on the stone plinth. Here they discovered they could barely move, almost as if each had acquired an elephant sitting on their sternums. With some effort, Romana turned her head to face the doctor. With equal difficulty, he rolled his eyes in her direction.
I didn't know we could do that,
she rasped out. The doctor shook his head a little.
I don't think we can. Not us ordinary Time Lords, at any rate. I suspect something has happened to her during her time in the bulk.
Before Romana could respond, the Rani strode towards them and yelled,
You two! The architects of my misfortune, and yet heralds of my release. How sweet an irony. Yet one I would have happily forgone.
Romana painfully turned her head in the direction of the Rani.
I see you've done something with my hair, and my old clothes, and my face. Is this a new look? Is this what they call grunge?
The Rani gave another yell of rage and pain. She twisted her right hand a little, and Romana groaned. For her, it now felt more like 2 elephants. The doctor felt it was time to offer an alternative target.
Come now, Rani, why the ire? You can't possibly be angry at us. You've got everything you desired. Free and unfettered passage to the bulk. I'm surprised you came back at all.
The Rani's scowl switched to the doctor. At the same time, he suddenly knew the weight of twin pachyderms. The doctor's plan had some success, though. Romana now felt she was only entertaining 1.5 tuskers.
Got what I wanted.
The Rani shrieked.
You knew this would happen. This was why you let me go in the first place. And you called me monster.
In spite of the increased pressure, the doctor managed to hiss out a response.
Believe me, we knew nothing of the workings of the bulk then, and precious little more now. What happened to you?
The Rani appeared to calm a little, but more from a desire to convey her tale coherently than from any intention to forgive the other 2 Time Lords.
You knew the scale was wrong.
She growled at the doctor.
You knew I was but a flea, a microbe compared to the main bulk entities. Once I was in their 11th-dimensional realm. I could not commune with them. They could not even see me, or sense me at all in any meaningful way. So there I was, like a germ in a pore on the skin of a Cthulhu. There wasn't even means of sustenance. That was how I ended up like this.
Now Romana sought to relieve some of the pressure on the doctor.
I was wondering about your skincare routine. Have you been trading tips with Dr. Nugati there?
With this last remark, Romana made her best effort to nod towards the charred, probable corpse lying nearby. At another twist from the Rani, Romana felt the weight of 2 elephants once more.
You insolent cur! Ha! Nugati had his uses, though, but I'm coming to that. No, first I had to survive, and so, like a flea or tick, I drew sustenance directly from the body of that bulk entity I was marooned on, while he remained utterly oblivious. But it wouldn't work, not like he was. He was indigestible, and so I had to begin mixing my own regeneration energy into his blood to make him more compatible. It gave me greater powers, such as you are experiencing right now. But he also began to slowly replicate the effect of a failed regeneration, until I was left looking as you see me now.
The doctor, having recovered his wind a little, saw his chance to shine.
So, you survived, you thrived, you triumphed.
He hissed as grandiosely as his lungs would allow.
But why come back? And more importantly, how did you manage it?
The Rani sneered at the doctor as she shifted the majority of the weight once more to him.
Grubbing by in the bulk while slowly deteriorating was hardly my ideal of ultimate knowledge and power. However, I did begin to learn something of how you lower dimensional beings commune with the bulk entities, or at least believe they do. It is always some more minor entity who actually pulls the strings from the bulk to the denizens of the lower universes. It was simplicity itself to become one of those and start manipulating and maneuvering the puppets of this universe. And so, as I said, Nugati served his purpose. I hope he enjoys eternity as a charcoal briquette. So, Rani,
Romana croaked.
now you're home, do you plan to resume your pastime of aping me? Go into retirement, perhaps?
The Rani roared in frustration, pain, and more than a little mania.
Retire? I think not. I may have been a microbe in the bulk, but here, I think you find few bigger fish. I think you'd be surprised by just what I can do.
With that, she pointed both palms straight down at the floor. With an agonized expression and a scream of pain, she launched straight up into the air, columns of blackened smoke issuing from her hands. In many ways, these coiling pillars of vapour were reminiscent of the black winged thing Dr. Nugati had summoned. Like that same creature, the Rani rose up towards the ceiling, still screaming, and disappeared up the same hidden flue.
I didn't know we could do that either,
Romana said, propping herself up on one elbow, her breathing coming more normally now. The doctor rolled onto his side to face her, propping his head up with his hand, elbow on the stony floor.
Again,
he began patiently.
I don't think we can.
I fear the Rani is now something more, almost certainly more terrible. With that, they each helped one another to their feet and brushed themselves off.
So, still more trouble to come?
Romana asked.
Seems we never get a break,
she added. The doctor shook his head, brightening and smiling. Oh, no, no, no. Today has been a good day. Yes, there was the minor setback of releasing the Rani once more upon an unsuspecting universe, but we shouldn't dwell on the negative. Here he gestured around with his arms raised, seeming not just to take in the vast cavern around them with this gesture, but in fact all of existence. The universe is still here, he cried triumphantly. Then his arms dropped. He strode back to the monolith, and Romana followed. Once there, the doctor reached into the recess and plucked out the winged scarab amulet, the source of so many woes. He popped it into his satchel for safekeeping, then turned to face Romana once more. When next he spoke, his tone had lost some of its bravado. Well, we did at least prevent the greater peril. There was no full bulk entity incursion today. That we know of. Fingers crossed. Romana looked at the doctor quizzically.
Fingers crossed? Since when did you become so superstitious?
The doctor attempted to frown at her, but was betrayed by the twitching corners of his mouth. Well, you did keep reminding me I was lucky 13. Romana laughed, and the doctor could not help but join her. Together, they picked up the unconscious and gently snoring Nathan Aeonne, P.I., and began to search for the way out.